Thank you very much for coming back to the beginning of our panel. Today we have an excellent panel which is dedicated to Ruth Bondy. Many of you know who she was. For some of you who may not, perhaps, I'd like to read about her. Ruth Bondy was an Israeli journalist, author, translator, and Holocaust researcher born in Prague. In 1942, she was deported with her family to Terezin Ghetto, and from there in 1943 to Auschwitz-Birkenau and various labor camps. When she was liberated from Bergen-Belsen, she weighed 32 kilos. After a short return to Czechoslovakia, she joined the Overseas Recruitment Corps and emigrated to the newly founded State of Israel in 1948. In 1952, she started a successful career as a journalist, becoming one of Israel's leading columnists and the first woman to win the prestigious Israeli Sokolov Award. She authored 4 books, biographies, memoirs, and studies about the Czech Jewry, and translated many works of Czech literature. And as I said, this panel is dedicated to her. We have an excellent group of presenters today with very interesting topics. And our first presenter is Tal Bashan. Tal was born in Israel. She is the daughter of author and Holocaust survivor and researcher Ruth Bondy and journalist Raphael Bashan. She served as an officer in the Israeli army, studied political science and international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and was editor of in her youth, editor of the university student paper. She has served for 35 years as a senior journalist and editor for 2 major newspapers in Israel, Ma'ariv and Yediot Ahronot, as Ma'ariv's correspondent in the West Coast in the United States, as well as lecturer of feature writing at Tel Aviv University. And she is also a board member and very active in the Beit Terezin, the Holocaust Remembrance Center for Czech Jewry in Kibbutz, Givat, Haim, Ichud. And I'm very have the honor to announce the topic she will talk about. It is about feminine dilemmas in the ghetto and concentration camp, the testimonies of Ruth Bondy. Please.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, and I'm honored for your dedication of this seat for the memory of my mother. I'm here to introduce a bit the writings and evidence of, as was said, my mother, who was a Holocaust survivor, journalist, author, translator, and she wrote about her experiences and also dedicated many of her years to research the Holocaust of Czech Jewry and mainly Ghetto Terezin. My mother, just a bit of background, my mother was born in Prague in 1923. On May 1942, she was deported with her family to Theresienstadt Ghetto. This is my mother. I'll have to look a bit back. And in December 1943, she was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in what was called a family camp. If we can go to show Theresienstadt Ghetto and the family camp. I will explain later what it was in Birkenau. And over there, she cared for young children who were later murdered in the gas chambers. In July 1943, she was transferred to labor camps in the Hamburg region, where she cleared rubbles of bomb buildings. She was then imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen. When she was liberated, she was sick with typhoid. Her parents and 25 members of her family, my grandparents, perished in the Holocaust Only she and her sister, Edith, survived. Her sister is still with us. She's 97. My mother passed away 5 years ago on the age of 95. We can continue. Shall I do it? But I'm like I can't divide my, like a male. And after she immigrated to Israel with no Hebrew, she mastered the language and became one of Israel's most well-known columnists and authors. She was one of the few founders of Beit Terezin, the Memorial Center for Czech Jewry, where I'm now a board member. Some of my mother's books, this is my mother and a sister who is still with us. Yes, this is Terezin. And the next one would be the family camp in Birkenau. And my mother, amongst other books, wrote a few who dealt or researched the Holocaust. One of them was The Elder of the Jews, Jacob Edelstein of Theresienstadt, published in 1981, about the head of the Judenrat in Theresienstadt and about the Jews of Ghetto Terezin, and about herself, but she didn't mention herself. She was there. And another book is called Trapped, Essays on the History of Czech Jews between 1939 and 1943. We can go on showing the covers of the books. You can look them up later. She also wrote a number of autobiographic and essay books, including a book called Hold Fragments. In Hebrew, it's called Shvarim Shlemim, her autobiography from which I'll be quoting here. Her books have been translated to Czech, English, and German. She also, as you said, translated most of the classic Czech literature, including Hašek, Čapek, Kundera, etc., and won many, many prizes in Israel. She was married, my mother, to my father. He was a journalist too. His name was Raphael Bashan, and I'm their only daughter, born after a high-risk pregnancy on December 18th, the same date that she arrived to Birkenau, which in itself is quite symbolic, I would say. As I said, she died on November 2017. Gladly, her works continue to live and impact, including 3 new books that I published since her passing away. She was also the grandmother of 2 beloved grandchildren, Dor, 36, my son, and Carmel, 33, an actress who continues the legacy and deals a lot with the 3rd generation, and wrote a satirical review about the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, about the commercial and populist sides of the Holocaust Memorial. On a personal note, I should say, and the people, your women you talked about reminded me a bit of her. She was a unique person, strong, original, insightful, and humoristic, including black humor in her writings and also in life. For instance, just a small anecdote, when she talked about the past before the war, although she was a very bright student, her parents decided she would go to a secretarial school, which she of course hated, in order that she get married soon. And I have her dowry, by the way, with me. You know, this is how it was then. And she used to say that Hitler saved me from a destiny of a clerk. So you understand the humor, which was actually true. She also used to say, and this is one of the key ideas that I would like to pass to you from her, that, I quote, "The Holocaust is no excuse, not for self-pity or unacceptable behavior." So you can already imagine the type, I'm sure you know. Although in dealing with the Holocaust, my mother basically used to think and say, I quote, "Cyclone B did not differentiate between men and women. The same death waited for them all." Once she delved into the subject, she found quite a few unique female experiences and dilemmas, including her own. Even before the camps, the packing for the deportation for the ghetto that was done mainly by women. Only 50 kilos were allowed per person, and the great dilemma, what to take, something we can all relate to, that haunted her for many years in her nightmares. And I quote, "The pain of leaving my favorite possessions behind, knowing I'll never see them again, was mingled with the fear I wouldn't manage to pack what I needed on time and that I would leave with nothing." And this was a recurrent nightmare she had. The other traumatic memory that she found was more typical to women, that stayed with her for life, as she described it, was not the hunger, not the fear, it was the filth, dirt. Dealing with the smells, the filthy lavatories, the smells in the barracks, the lice, the fleas, the terrible smells of the bodies burning, the impossibility to cleanse, that she claimed was harder for her and many other women than the hunger. And here I quote, it's a bit hard for me because the print is very small, but I will try to do it. Because she wrote so beautifully, and I let her speak in her own words. At a meeting in Kibbutz Dafna with the high school pupils studying the Holocaust, we were asked, the 4 Holocaust survivors, sitting at the debating table, what was the hardest part of it? The 3 men replied as one, the hunger. And I said, the filth. I was at the same camps with them. I survived as they did on dirty, foul-smelling water that passed as soup, and the lump of clavey, bitter bread. I dreamt of a whole pot to myself of potatoes. And at our liberation, I weighed 35 kilos, and yet the hunger did not, as far as I can see, leave me scarred. But the memory of the filth refuses to go. A dirty lavatory makes me feel sick, and for years I relived in my dreams the horror of looking for a lavatory, for a spot where there were no feces. I hate people who don't shower, either out of choice or out of ideology. I can't take the smell of a sweaty bodies on the bus. I have a deep need for cleanliness. So this was one feminine angle that you could think about. In her last book, it's called Last Words, that was published. I found it on her computer and I published it after she passed. She dedicated a whole chapter called Life in the Filth to the subject, which she claimed was not researched enough, mainly because it was undescribable, undrawable, and unacademic enough. But it still was a major issue. On a personal note, I can tell an anecdote that my mother used to get up at 5 a.m., rain or shine. She went to swim and then she started working. And when I asked her once how she manages to get up so early, she said, I got used to it in the camps. She always got up earlier than others so she could be first at some dripping tap she discovered with a few drops before all the other 60 women in the barrack in the ghetto. In her books, my mother wrote about the struggles of women in the ghetto to keep their femininity as long as they could, about losing their period, trying to keep a little corner on their bunk that they could call home, about parting from men, husbands, sons, fathers, who were sent early from Terezin to labor camps, like her father, my grandfather, Joseph Bondy, who was sent to Kaufering camp and died there near the end of the war. My grandmother, Franziska, died in the ghetto due to a typical feminine chore. She was knitting a scarf for my aunt's birthday, and she got accidentally stabbed by the needle. And from that, she got blood sepsis, and since there were no antibiotics in the ghetto, she died from that 2 days later, as my mother said, saving herself from the horror of the gas chambers. But she died proud, that also my mother describes, because many women started working in the ghetto. Housewives who have not done anything before suddenly returned to be useful and needed. And she was very proud of her clerical work in the ghetto. That appears in the book Trapped by Yad Vashem publishing house. On a different and much more controversial subject, I can also mention here, and I'm sure there will be other people who will oppose, the position my mother had and wrote about towards the connection made by some research between women in the Holocaust and sex. On her own words, which I will not quote fully here because of our time, she used to say that every time she described that she was there, and she was 18, and she was with 60 women in barracks, or 100 women in the other camp, and in Birkenau, and Bergen-Belsen. And from her experience, there was nothing institutional, only sex for bread or sex for survival, but nothing, like Koschitzky described, for instance, and that always the researchers used to tell her that she's probably suppressing the memory. She has not come to terms with the memory yet. And she used to cynically say, well, what do I know? I was only there, So, but this all minimizes in my mother's testimonies and writings compared to the suffering of mothers of young children and the horrifying choice mothers had to make in the family camp in Birkenau. I will explain for a minute. Oh, that's us in the end, but we can go back a little to show the family camp. The family camp in Birkenau was a one-time thing. They put the inmates from Terezin there with no selection for six months in case the Red Cross, who visited Terezin earlier, as you know, will ask about them. They all knew it was temporary, and they had a deadline, in the full sense of the word, for June 43. In that camp, my mother, then 20, took care of the young children, and I will describe it for a minute here. And they had to come to the terrible decisions. I was taking care of a group of children aged 5 and 6 in the children's home, set up through the efforts of Freddie Hirsch, a handsome young sports instructor of Maccabi Hatzair with a German background who knew how to speak to the SS personnel. You should read, there's films about him, very interesting figure. The mothers of the children in my care, Evichka, Mishenka, Karlichek, Hanichka, and others, were at first suspicious. Perhaps the kindergarten teacher was taking the children's food. In time, they learned to trust me. At most, I wiped the soup pot round with my finger after the soup was served. I took the children for a walk. She used to take them up and down, showing them one crow, one tree. And before there was a big selection, and before that mothers could have gone to labor. They didn't know, they were able to enlist to some labor work outside, and mothers came to her for advice, what to do, to leave the children, stay with them. What would you do? I tried to hedge. I don't know. I don't have a child of my own. But they wouldn't leave me alone. But even so, I told them, I think if I had a child, I'd stay with it. They nodded. That was what they had made, they wanted to hear. They had made the decision. I parted from the children in my group and their mothers before we who got through the selection left the camp, still unsure if it was for selection or for death, with the feeling we had abandoned them. A week later, by which time I was in Hamburg, the family camp was destroyed and all who remained there were taken to the gas chambers. Witnesses said the children were very quiet. For years, I was haunted by the dreadful responsibility I'd taken on myself. These mothers were young, and they had they not stayed with the children, they may have been saved and started a new family. But how can one live with the thought of a child abandoned in the most horrific hour of its life? When my daughter Tal was born, I asked myself again, would I have stayed to hold her hand in the gas chamber? The answer was the same every time. I would have never left her. So you understand that I was born with a big history burden and lived with it. And my mother also describes what it was to be a mother of a child after the Holocaust, going through the Holocaust, how to keep normal and raise a normal child, which I hope I am, I'm not sure. We will check that. I talked to Tali about the Holocaust, and a bit here, a bit there, in answer to her questions. I preferred episodes which had an amusing side to them. How I smuggled cucumbers from the German staff vegetable garden in the ghetto, stuffed in my bra, etc. And she concludes and says, I tried not to tell her the horrific stories. The burden of the Jewish past piled onto shoulders of the young generation in Israel is too heavy without me, as we see now. I would like to conclude with two short stories from after the liberation. After coming to Israel, as you know, or maybe not know, the treating of survivors, of Holocaust survivors, was not so friendly and not so welcoming. The people were quite reserved, in an understatement. They saw them either human dust were called, or who went to cattle to massacre the ones who didn't fight, etc. It didn't suit the new country's narrative. And my mother, she always described these looks and questions. How did you survive? Maybe you're a whore or a couple. And after 2 years from when she came to Israel, she decided to erase her number in a small operation. So people will not address her about that. Also, she said in summer, Israel is always summer, so you go with bare hands. And she didn't want people to talk to her about it. She felt they always had something to say to her, which she didn't want to hear. And the doctor, she described, asked her, aren't you, this is an honor, this is something historical, don't you want to? And she said, it needs more than a number that should forget or remember what we went through in the Holocaust. A feminist side to that was that she asked the clerk, the Polish clerk who made the numbers, to make a small, pretty number, okay? So it will be aesthetic, and she gave her a sweater. So even there you can see the feminine side. So it was a small scar. And this, I grew with the mother without a number. And finally, I would say that, yes, many of my friends told about houses that no one spoke there, as you described. There was dark holes that we could not recover. Thankfully, my mother did write about everything in her own way, but her message always, and this is what I would like maybe for people to take onwards with them, was a few things. First, that evil is not ended in this world, and the Holocaust was not a one-time thing, as she saw it, and as we know and we see now. And that but there are always good people on the way, which she even encountered in the camps, in Nazis. One Nazi picked her bread that fell, someone else helped her. And finally, of course, that the good is not self-understood in life. And as she wrote, and we put it on her gravestone, I will quote, the good is never self-understood in my eyes. I'm all the time aware of the fragility of the existence of the human race. And as we see, this continues. So I invite you to look her up and read more about her, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting and emotional presentation. I forgot to say that in our panel we have 3 presenters, not 4, so that's why each presenter has maybe a few minutes, 2 or 3 more. But I'd like to have time, because we have to finish at 12:30, I'd like to have time, some 15 minutes after all 3 presenters, for the questions and answers. So we're going to try to stick to our timetable. Our next presenter is, so we'll have the discussion after all the presentations. Our next presenter is Roseanna Ramsden. She is a Montague Burton Research and Teaching Fellow in Jewish Studies in the School of Fine Arts, History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds. She was awarded her PhD by Northumbria University in 2021. Her research interests include Holocaust testimony and representation, women's and queer history, and queer and feminist theory. She has published on feminist eco-critical reflections and women's post-Holocaust identities and queerness in women's Holocaust memoirs. And she has a very interesting topic she will enlighten us about. It is reanalyzing familiar narratives, representations of queerness in women's published testimonies of the Holocaust. Please.
Is that better?
Ah, good.
Okay, so my paper today is based on my forthcoming book, which considers both how gender ideals and expectations shape the way women construct narratives of the past in their Holocaust testimonies, and how they determine the ways those narratives are read and received. By offering and modelling interdisciplinary rereadings of women's published testimonies, it aims to open up new ways of viewing the texts in all of their complexity, and give voice to the silences in the historical canon which traditional paradigms of gender and sexuality have facilitated. This paper will focus on one of its chapters. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about the testimony of Krystyna Jewulska. She was born under the name Zofia or Sonia Landau in 1914. In 1941, she and her family were resettled in the Warsaw Ghetto. She escaped in 1942 and began working for the Polish resistance movement, posing as an Aryan Pole until her arrest in 1943, and she assumed the name Krystyna Jewulska under questioning, and she was then deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau as a political prisoner. After the war, she remained in Poland working as a writer, and she married and had 2 sons. Besides writing satirical pieces, Jewulska wrote of her experiences in her testimony, I Came Back, which was translated into English from the original Polish in 1951. She, however, concealed her Jewishness until she wrote a book about the Warsaw Ghetto in 1963. Thus, I Came Back begins with Jewulska's time in prison and is devoted to the experiences of a political prisoner in Birkenau, including rivalries and friendships with other detainees, sickness, hunger, and work duties. Writing of Birkenau while still in quarantine as she waited to be allocated work, Jewulska launches into a description of a sight she came across while walking around the Vice, looking for familiar faces or a place to sit. She begins, I looked into the latrine. It was frightfully crowded. I noticed a few free places. As I was making my way in that direction, someone called, don't go, watch out. Sitting on the boards in the space between was a mannish-looking German woman, a black Winkel. On her knees sat a very feminine girl with long hair. She gazed at her partner with rapture, then she kissed her on the mouth. It was a long kiss. You couldn't imagine anything more revolting, this kind of love in these surroundings. I rushed out and ran across the Vice, feeling revolted and dirty. The other women were killing lice. I also began to itch. Something was crawling all over me. I put my hand inside my belt and found something, the first louse. I did not know how to kill it. The louse cracked between my nails. It's important to Jewry, as it is to a number of women who produced testimonies in the immediate post-war years, to tell the reader about the sex she witnessed between two women, one of whom was an asocial prisoner. As Margaret Ann Hutton has argued, the frequency of such representations might be because same-sex relationships may have been widespread in the camps, and they may have been sufficiently distanced from the deportees' everyday experience outside the camps to appear noteworthy. And as Claudia Schottman has observed, the equation of lesbian equals asocial made by the SS was largely shared by detainees. The denigration of female homosexuality seemed to assure their moral superiority. Thus, Jewry's conscious decision to include this passage at once provides a window into sexualized power relations between women prisoners at Birkenau and shores up her claims to normalcy and morality. Yet, there is arguably more to unpick here, and it was this excerpt that inspired the writing of the chapter on which this paper is based, and that's why I've used it as an introduction to what I want to talk about, which is not only how some survivors write about same-sex sex and relationships during the Holocaust in their accounts, but about how we read those testimonies and the possibility of reading them differently. Jewry's description reads as somewhat coded in its ambiguity. She follows her description of the couple with her feelings of dirtiness and itchiness. She doesn't begin a new paragraph and therefore suggests that the relationship between the two events, witnessing the sex act and her itchiness, was one of cause and effect. What's more, she at first leaves the something that was crawling all over her unidentified. While she might well be referencing the louse that she claims to have not known how to kill, it also reads as an allusion to sexual anxiety, or perhaps even sexual arousal, that Jewry suggests she struggled to suppress or kill. That the itch originated below her belt, too, reads as suggestive of sexual arousal and discomfort with the feelings that witnessing the act may have inspired. Jewry and many women who produced early testimonies not only dedicate space in their accounts of the Holocaust to same-sex relationships in the camps, but whether deliberately or unconsciously, they construct descriptions of such that are layered and often ambiguous. It's my position, then, that reading practices informed by queer theory or a queering of the ways that we read and interpret Holocaust testimonies help us to understand these texts in all of their diversity. Building on the pioneering work on gender and sexuality in the Holocaust by Zoe Waxman, Anna Haikova, and Jennifer Evans, among others, then I here model a queered, recuperative approach to rereading the text that I hope to show can make visible complexities, layers, and ambiguities in women's writing about queer relationships during the Holocaust. In this, I provide a consciously queered historical and literary analysis of testimony, one that, in Jennifer Evans' words, takes nothing for granted and emphasizes both self-reflexivity and critique of overly simplistic, often binary analyses and overlap, contingency, competing forces, and complexity. To queer history, she writes, is to linger over our own assumptions and interrogate the role that they play in the past we seek out and recreate in our writing. To do so, I apply a critical reading practice inspired by Bonnie Zimmerman's technique of reading into the shadows, into the spaces between words. In her queer reading of Anne Frank's diary, Amy Elman also uses this technique of interpretation, describing it as a method of reading between the lines. She elaborates that this does not mean finding lesbians where none exist. Rather, one is especially careful to avoid presumptions of heterosexuality. This approach is used here in two case studies in an effort to challenge and avoid replicating the heterosexism of much traditional Holocaust scholarship, and to shine a light on reflections on sexuality and queer sex in women's testimonies that are ambiguous and complex. So these testimonies and these ways of reading them let us pay attention to elements of women's accounts which largely go overlooked in scholarship. If you read these testimonies, you notice the consistent use of the language of fear and disgust. So these experiences were obviously important, and they felt compelled to retell them. Also, none of these testimonies are written in the first person. They're always written in the third person about other people. And I'm going to focus on one here because it's an evocative account and it illustrates well the ambiguities that are often flattened or glossed over. So it's the account of Wanda Patawska, a devout Catholic born in Lublin in 1921. She was arrested by the Gestapo in February 1941 for her work with the Polish resistance. She was interrogated and tortured before her deportation to Ravensbrück in September 1941. She was transported from there to Neustadt-Gliwice in 1945. After the war, Patawska remained in Poland, where she married and had 4 children. She graduated with a degree in medicine, specializing in psychiatry, and worked as a professor. Over the course of her career, she spoke openly about and produced literature on her views against contraception, abortion, and homosexuality. Her account was written in the summer of 1945, and it wasn't intended for publication. It was produced because following liberation, she suffered with nightmares, hence the book's title, and I Am Afraid of My Dreams. In 1961, Patavska was persuaded to publish it. She writes of the publication process, "I looked it over. It seemed to me too intimate, too macabre, so I removed a few paragraphs. The gaps that they left behind seemed eloquent enough." In this, she speaks to what is at the heart of this project, what the gaps in testimony, what is said and what is not said, can tell us about experience and the ways that survivors construct the past. Patavska's testimony deals with her imprisonment and her experiences in Ravensbrück, particularly the medical experimentations she was subjected to. She writes of the kindness of fellow prisoners, but also of rivalry and of lice, disease, and forced labour. She also dedicates much space to humanity. Reflection on the humanity she recognised in her German persecutors, for example, precedes the following 3-page passage, too long to quote fully, on the inhumanity of the women engaging in queer sex acts in Block LL, to which she was moved in 1942. She describes her and her friend Krizia's experiences in the block as such. Block LL, I go cold at the mere thought of it. Those women, the block where we first understood the full hideousness of that odd word LL, the initials of lesbian love. I managed to shield Krizia from seeing some of what took place while that word LL acquired a hideous, inhuman reality. Whatever will become of us, I asked myself. A couple of years from now, will we be like that too? I don't really know if Krizia understood why I stopped giving her a goodnight kiss. Maybe she even resented my not doing so. But the incredible goings-on in that block destroyed my faith in the innocence of even the simplest human gesture. I gave up believing in affection or purity. Often at night, it took me ages to get to sleep. At first, I couldn't credit what was happening and watched wide-eyed, torn between curiosity and despair. The last shreds of humanity were slowly disappearing. Lesbian love, love, love. She continues, describing one woman who wrote her a letter asking if they could meet in Block 12. Zarita had seemed like a gentle girl with great black velvety eyes. Only now did I understand the meaning of those inviting glances. It was horrible and sad, and I wanted no part in it. I stopped looking in Zarita's direction, but sometimes I would accidentally catch her eye, and what I saw there made me frightened. I recoiled at first, but soon began to feel pity. Propositions came thick and fast. Apparently I was in demand as a woman as well as a man. I felt hemmed in, constantly threatened. Women who at first had recoiled in disgust, little by little gave up the unequal struggle. It spread like a plague, like a bushfire, like a consuming passion. I looked on, terrified, and concentrated my efforts on preventing Krizia from seeing the worst of what was happening. But in the end, of course, she did see. How could she not see those awful scenes when they were actually being enacted by our own bedside? She cried for a long time that night and never again came to say good night to me in bed, at least not in the same way as before. These passages reveal Patavska's efforts in the crafting of her account to assert her own humanity and moral superiority over the women she so enthusiastically condemns. Similarly, they reveal the fear of the real or imagined threat posed by queer women in the camps. Numerous women write about this in their accounts. They also provide an insight into the now widely documented homophobia among prisoners and are indicative of the homophobic views that would go on to underpin Patavska's medical work. Yet while these issues should not be underemphasized, nor must women's depictions of same-sex relationships be interpreted only within the framework of normalizing the author's own relationships or identity. Patavska's condemnation of the relationships between the women is extreme, particularly given that in Ravensbrück, human life was quite literally extinguished every day through starvation, violence, and disease. Moreover, despite her overt disgust, this passage is unusually detailed. She references watching, seeing, and looking upon the sex acts taking place a total of 7 times within this 3-page passage, claiming she was torn between curiosity and despair. She seems to suggest that she ought to and could not help but watch, either through proximity or curiosity or both. Like Przewalska in her use of louse imagery, Patavska compares the development of same-sex relationships in the bloc, and particularly those that involved initially reluctant participants, to naturally occurring phenomena such as disease and natural disaster. This reads as indicative of a fear that queerness was in some way infectious or inevitable, and that she may have been susceptible to contracting it. The final comparison, consuming passion, is especially ambiguous, simultaneously symbolic of suffering and pain, as in its religious definition, and unbridled and potentially pleasurable emotion, as in its sexual definition. The tone of distress in these passages then can be interpreted as linked not only to homophobia, but to Petrovska's anxiety about her own liability to queerness. She even poses the rhetorical question, a couple of years from now, will we be like that too? In addition, and despite her overly defensive claim that she wanted no part in the sexual acts taking place, she tells us that she changed the manner in which she interacted with Chrysia. In this, we might wonder whether she alludes to a sense of discomfort caused not only by the relationships of the other women, but the undescribed nature of this friendship and the pair's bedtime ritual. Similarly, though Petrovska claims to have felt genuinely assaulted by Zarita's inviting glances, she describes her as a gentle girl with great black velvety eyes, and explains that despite her best efforts, she would sometimes accidentally catch her eye. This description stands at odds with Petrovska's assertion that to meet Zarita's eyes frightened her. Petrovska's writing about the relationships and sexualities of the women in Raven's book are complex. They read as coded reflections on a curiosity about queerness and an anxiety about the author's possible receptiveness to it. One interpretation is that this is the testimonial expression of anxiety, regards Petrovska's stability as conforming to codes of heteronormativity. As she made clear in the book's foreword, her testimony is a constructed, crafted text, and intentionally or unconsciously, it may have been shaped to make the narrative compatible with heteronormative expectations. Yet she does include allusions to and anxieties about her own sexuality while chronicling other women's sexual relationships, and in doing so illustrates the split between her desire to be perceived as ordinary and moral and the need to acknowledge her own sexual curiosity and anxieties. To reduce these writings solely to reflections on sexualized power and exploitation or to identity formation through the production of testimony is to overlook and obscure their layers. Challenging traditional paradigms of gender and sexuality and established assumptions by posing fresh questions of familiar texts can enable us to glean new insights of historical significance. I've demonstrated, I hope, that a self-consciously queer historical rereading of testimony opens up the possibility of exploring silences in the historical record and opens up new ways of viewing the text. Such an approach can make visible complexities that may otherwise be silenced, flattened, or overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will go on to our third and last presentation today, and this is by Stanislava Barać, who is my colleague and friend, much younger, of course. Stanislava Barać is a senior research associate at the Institute for Literature and Arts here in Belgrade. She has authored over 50 articles published in scholarly journals and has edited various collections and volumes. She has published 2 monographs. One is titled Avant-Garde and the other one Feminist Counter-Public, the genre of women's portraiture in Serbian periodicals 1920-1941. And she has also co-edited 4 additional volumes during her fruitful scholarly career. Stanislava Barać will speak about the title of her presentation is A Possible Approach to the Holocaust Experience and Memory Activism of the Yugoslav screenwriter Frida Filipović. Your floor.
Thank you, Krinka. As the title said, it is only one possible approach to the Holocaust experience and what I call memory activism of Frida Filipović, and perhaps the best way to open the topic is to begin in a biographical method manner, as Krinka Vidaković did in her keynote lecture. Frida Greif was born in an Ashkenazi Jewish family in Sarajevo in 1913, in Austro-Hungarian monarchy at the time. Thanks to her interview to the Shoah Foundation in 1998 and the very methodology of the interview, Frida Filipović told us in this interview 2 stories about her life and Holocaust experience, as well as how it intertwined with her professional development in prose writing. Taking into account other sources too, we know the following. As very young, Frida Greif sent her first short story to the most influential daily newspaper in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, to Politika. Editor of Feuilleton rubric, Živko Milićević, was known for supporting young women writers. However, he refused Frida's first short story, but encouraged her to write what was intrinsically closer to her sensibility, as he thought, and he was right, urban topics. The first one was about some rural subject. And, of course, he published all the later short stories of Frida Filipović. Frida changed her last name, Greif, from the first short story she published, in order not to be potentially confused with foreign translated writers in this rubric, and to be seen as a Yugoslav writer who originally wrote in Serbo-Croatian, as we heard also for the other women of this age. And for that reason, inventing the semi-pseudonym Frida Filipović, while this Filipović came from her father's name, Filip. Thus, she became one of the Yugoslav female writers who professionally developed in Belgrade during the second half of the 30s. This is one specific group of writers who was politically engaged in feminist and leftist direction, and distinguished because of writing about the tabooed women's experiences, such as young girls' sexuality, sexual freedoms, abortion, illegitimate pregnancy, as it was called, adultery, strange nuns, prostitution, and violence against women. All these subjects we can find in the short stories collected in the first author's collection of short stories from 1937. For this group of women writers, in a social and political sense, important is the concept of political generation and the Popular Front strategy developed at the time because of the global fascist threat. In an artistic and poetic sense, however, important is their ability and skill to shape heavy topics into the light and popular genres, and even to tell the tragic story in an entertaining way. Maybe that is this humor we were heard about. During the war, Frida Tasić, because that was now her official last name, she married young, Frida Tasić escaped to Vrnjačka Banja, but without her husband. As a Jew, of course, she got the yellow track and David's star, exactly the one in the first picture, but simply did not sew it to her coat. She didn't wear it simply. Her husband, a respectable scientist of the time, was afraid he would share his wife's potential destiny and asked her for a divorce. Frida at first also survived thanks to a false ID, we can see it in the second picture, with the name Mirjana Tasić. A little bit later, Nazis in the occupied area of Serbia, as well as in the independent state of Croatia, and we saw from the Krinka's presentation how complex the division of Yugoslav space was, but in both spaces, in the occupied zone of Serbia and the independent state of Croatia, Nazis unofficially or implicitly, as Frida explained later in the interview in 1998, decided to conduct the policy of not chasing and not imprisoning Jewish women who were married to Serbian or Croatian husbands. That is why Frida could move to Belgrade, and she moved to Belgrade again and lived untouched. That is also how it was possible to see this painting, this portrait of Frida Filipović. A famous Yugoslav avant-garde artist, Mihailo Petrov, made it in the middle of the war in 1943. It was possible to have things like that, while at the same time the closest members of Frida's family, her mother, sister and sister's son, were in the concentration camps and were killed in the concentration camps. This life period and some facts Frida will transform into themes and motives in the later 1973 story, as well as in her later novel in 2000. What we need to distinguish from all that is both the fact and literary motive of cowardice, the betrayal of her husband, at the basic level of humanity, as she would explain later in the interview. Life and Holocaust experience gave new material to already established authors' poetics. The main topic of that poetic were male-female relations, gender relations, but specifically male-female, female-male relations, and within it, love, power, marriage, and sex. This confluence of circumstances led later to the narrative choices of framing even the Holocaust theme this way. In other words, my thesis is that Filipović works on specific women's experiences in the Holocaust correspond with her pre-Holocaust established artistic poetics, and that was poetics of transposing female tabooed experience to the public and to the wider public. After the war, Frida continued to write short stories and started with her first screenplays. She took her artistic last name Filipović as the official one and officially divorced from her husband, the coward. The same generation of women authors from the 1930s, I haven't mentioned their names, but what is interesting, gave one of the first literary representation of the Holocaust in Yugoslav literatures. And here we can see the collection of short stories they published, where we can find at least one short story on the subject of the Holocaust. As we are speaking about Frida Filipović, in her short story Roses on Porcelain from 1951, but also published in this book from 1955, Frida Filipović depicts the Holocaust from the perspective of the female character, old woman Rosa Lang, née Weiss, in the independent state of Croatia. The motive of petit bourgeois simplicity and ignorance frames the tragic destiny of the powerless female character, which at the same time makes the story easy to read, but also more powerful in the final emotional effect of empathy. This depiction of the last hours of Rosa Lang, who is waiting to be taken by the Nazi police, while the whole of her life unfolds in her memory, is in fact the story written in the memory of Frida's mother. And we know about it from the interview much years later. Possible comparative analysis of this story could be with the story A Horrible Gameplay written by Desanka Maksimović. It's not a similar story, but just to have the context of women's Holocaust writing from early 50s. Maksimović depicts the Holocaust from the perspective of the other powerless and innocent group, the children. The plot develops by showing a group of Jewish and Serbian children playing together. They are playing the game Catch and Shoot the Jews. The next day in the story, the same group of Jewish children and their parents would be taken away. The characters of the children are, we could say, well versed in the methodology of fascist terror. They learned what it is. How much should we catch? Asked the younger Meshulam. Then the oldest Gabbai spoke. For one German, you need 100 Jews and communists, and there are not that many of us. Ivan, the other boy from the story, thought for a moment and decided, we are children. 10 of us are enough for one German. Even in this story, when it comes to the weakest and the most innocent, Desanka Maksimović did not want to portray them exclusively as victims, and that is what will be characteristics of Frida Filipović narration later. While they are playing shooting, children are playing the last words, the shout of resistance to the occupier before the very shooting. One of them shouts, "Long live freedom." What the children's death really looked like in the story will not be shown, but the story will end with the image of their friend Ivan, who dreams that the boys, while fascists throwing them into the Sava River, just here, repeated these very words, "Long live the freedom." After that, much years later, the Holocaust subject in Frida's work emerged again in 1965, 66, or 67. The Bitter Grass was a co-produced Yugoslav-German film based on Filipović's original screenplay. It had an alternative title, Witness Out of Hell. While the stories from Frida's and other women's writers' collection describe particular, let's say, marginal destinies of old and young Jewish women characters, the film exposes the gender experience of women in Auschwitz and the additional trauma resulting from the requirement to bear witness to the original trauma. What initiated and maybe forced Frida Filipović to write the screenplay and all the co-production to make a movie was the Frankfurt trials. The main character of the film, Leah Weiss, is a Polish Jew who used to be subjected to Nazi medical experiments. She was also forced to have sexual relations. The audience comes to this realization gradually, thanks to the flawless craftsmanship in the crime and thriller genre, which produces the tension and excitement for the audience. These, let's say, positive sensations make it possible to communicate, possible for the screenwriter and the director to communicate the truth of the Holocaust. In this case, the truth of specifically women's experience of the Holocaust. This, however, does not nearly reflect all the feminist engagement of the scripted story and the film as a whole. The director, Žika Mitrović, as Merima Omeragić has noticed, fully adopted the feminist optic of the screenwriter. The heroine became persecuted for the second time when the Nazi trials began and she was seen as a potential witness. Leah Weiss is trying to run away both from the still active Nazis who are threatening her and from the good guys, prosecutors. Feminist interventions in narrating the Holocaust-specific women's experiences lay in the three main interventions of the screenwriter. One, Frida Filipović moved the public attention from the perpetrator to the female victim. Two, she chose to build the character of the victim unconventionally and against all stereotypes at the beginning of the film. Namely, Leah is a relatively older woman who lives with a paid lover. In Auschwitz, she was a lover of the chief camp physician and a prostitute in the camp bordel for the inmates. And third, the protectors of Leah Weiss, prosecutors, at the moment of realization of these facts in film, suddenly establish a position of reserve and condemnation towards the victim. I have no time, but the most important things come now.
We have one more presenter. So
we have. I understood we don't have. It
was my mistake. I'm sorry.
Then I would not talk about. All these developments led to even greater traumatization and the heroine to commit suicide, which is not, as Kerstin Steitz argues, her choice, as we all know. Just to say a few words, that through the convincing acting interpretation of Irene Papas, Frida Filipović explicitly tells the audience the following: the woman victim does not refuse to testify because of shame. Woman victim does not feel obligated to answer anyone about how she saved her life in the death camp, but she is afraid of something else, namely that she will not have the strength to confront her sex offender again and to relive the same feelings again. Frida Filipović in this film arranged the sequence of events and the discovery of facts in such a way that the heroine achieves at least narrative justice when she cannot achieve legal justice. And the narrative justice is in the described feminist optic, feminist point of view of the film.
Thank you very much. I apologize to everyone, especially Sara Horowitz, because her presentation will be online and we have enough time for all the presentations. Sara Horowitz is a professor of comparative literature and humanities and former director of the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University in Toronto. She is the author of Voicing the Void, Muteness and Memory in Holocaust Fiction, which received the Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Book, and she served as the senior founding editor of the Azrieli series of Holocaust Memoirs, Canada. She is the editor or co-editor of Shadows in the City of Light, Paris, in post-war French Jewish writing, Hans Günther Adler, Life Literature Legacy, which received the Canadian Jewish Literary Award. She is author of other books as well. And Sara Horowitz will be speaking about the following topic. Her title is, Since When Can't a Virgin Be a Whore? The Dynamics of Shame and Agency in Women's Accounts of the Shoah. Sara, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my presentation, my screen with you. Okay. I'm hoping you can see that. I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm really very moved to be on a panel dedicated to Ruth Bondy, whom I had occasion to meet several times, and I admired her. And I apologize for being on Zoom, but at the last minute, my connecting flight was canceled. So here I am speaking to you from Israel. So the title of my presentation borrows from Ida Fink's short story, Aryan Papers, which describes what might be termed transactional sex between a 16-year-old Jewish girl and an older male colleague who helps her to obtain the false documents that identify her and her mother as Aryan Poles. Fink's writing emphasizes the girl's sexual inexperience, her difficulty in agreeing to this non-financial part of their transaction, and the man's knowing exploitation of her desperation. Fink subtly indicates the man's callousness. He laughingly tells his friend that the girl was both a virgin and a whore. The story sets up a tension between the girl's sense of the shamefulness of the bargain and her resolve to do what she can for herself and her mother, a tension in a sense between victimization and agency. Whether the two women survive and how the girl might come back to look on her transaction remains unresolved. In his essay, Shame, Primo Levi situates shame as an emotion that surfaces in survivors of the Shoah, quote, just as they felt they were again becoming men, that is, responsible, and in a position to pronounce judgment on their behavior during the war. Levi reflects, quote, coming out of the darkness, one suffered because of the reacquired consciousness of having been diminished. We endured filth, promiscuity, and destitution, suffering much less than we would have suffered from such things in normal life, because our moral yardstick had changed. We had not only forgotten our country and our culture, but also our family, our past, the future we had imagined for ourselves, because like animals, we were confined to the present moment. Levi links shame not simply with degradation and humiliation, but with moral culpability, with, in his words, quote, the awareness that we had not done anything or not enough, against the system into which we had been absorbed. Shame for Levi is connected to how one sees oneself and how one imagines others see you. It emerges as, quote, a self-accusation or accusation of having failed in terms of human solidarity, of having omitted to offer help, of having failed to respond to the demand for solidarity, for a human word, advice, even just a listening ear. Levi's extended reflection on shame suggests that shame is an ethical category and in some measure a post-war retrospective phenomenon rather than something experienced at the time. He terms it belated shame. I believe it also has a narrative component, something about how one constructs memory and tells the story of one's past, both to oneself and to others. For Levi, of course, shame is connected to the memory of powerlessness and inaction, and interwoven with what it means to be a man. While one could argue that by man, Levi means human, regardless of gender, I would like to examine the way narratives by women negotiate the gender dynamics of shame and its relationship to agency, particularly with reference to sexual assault, barter, and other kinds of relations. Not only literary authors, but ordinary people craft memory narratives, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes deliberately. Survivors of the Shoah shape the way they narrate their memories, crafting stories about the past in ways that help us understand how they make or refute meaning from their experience. We see this both in written genres and in oral accounts. In the time allotted, I will look briefly at 3 sets of memory narratives and how they negotiate in retrospect the tensions between shame and agency. Written in the late 1940s, but not published until 2020, Sonia Kaplan's memoir, Passport to Retrieve, carves out a situational ethics away from male authority. Born Sonia Ruskis, part of a tightly connected upper-middle-class extended family, the author recollects the last Seder in Poland. On Passover 1939, Sonia's revered grandfather announced that there was no future for Jews in Poland, that it was time to move the family textile business to Canada. He delegated several of his children, including Sonia's father, to go and lay the groundwork, intending for everyone in the family to follow shortly. By September 1939, almost everyone at the Seder was safe in North America, but Sonia, her mother, and her younger sister were still in Poland. On their own, Sonia quickly takes charge, looking after basic necessities, negotiating with authorities, and strategizing the best moves under duress. From afar, Sonia's father engages in multi-pronged efforts to protect his family and move them from the reach of the Nazi genocide. The memoir's title derives from the Nigerian passports that Sonia's father was able to obtain for them, which offered them a small but crucial measure of protection and ultimately freedom. As the genocidal net tightens around them, Sonia, still a teenager, notices that some neighboring women have been engaging in sexual relations with Nazi officers billeted in civilian homes in return for hard-to-obtain food items and fuel. Despite finding such bartering disgusting, and that's her word, she accepts the physical advances of a series of panting officers, again her phrase, in return for supplying the 3 women with food and fuel. Although Kaplan makes clear that by sheer luck, she was able to defer consummating these relationships until the men were deployed elsewhere, it is also clear that Sonia was prepared to fulfill that bargain. Uncharacteristic of memoirs written during the first few decades after the war, Sonia not only discloses instances of sexual barter, but also her coming of age sexually. She describes her relationship with her first lover as a counterforce to the death that loomed over them in the ghetto. Later, when finally on board the ship that will carry her to North America, she takes an American soldier as her lover, as an assertion of freedom. In all of these instances, the narrative insists on Sonia's agency, her right to do with her right to do what she wishes with her own body. A more fraught dynamic emerges in Fanya Gottesfeld-Heller's Strange and Unexpected Love, written in the late 1980s, published in 1993, later reissued as Love in a World of Sorrow. It's one of the first published memoirs to focus on a sexual transaction and the tension between shame and agency. An educated middle-class teenager, Fanya is urged by her parents to encourage the advances of a Ukrainian militiaman who has fallen in love with her. Eventually, the two have a sexual relationship that Fanya's memoir describes as both romantically loving and at the same time profitable. On the one hand, Fanya details her erotic pleasure and consent. On the other hand, she makes clear that because of this relationship, Jan arranges safe hiding places, not only for Fanya, but for her family. Looking back, Fanya acknowledges the deep love that Jan felt for her and she for him, but she also notes a constant undernote of shame. Her father promises her that after the war, quote, "No one will know. You will be clean, I promise you," suggesting, of course, that something about her behavior was not clean. After the war, her mother insists on keeping Fanya and Jan's relationship secret. Still, rumors persisted, and suitors expected her to be sexually available to them. Years later, she waits until her husband dies to publish the memoir, and even then, she once told me, her adult children actively tried to discourage her from publishing it so as not to shame her grandchildren. Finally, in 2017, Molly Applebaum's wartime diary was published together with her 1991 memoir, under the title Buried Words. Molly and an older cousin were hidden in a bunker-like hole beneath a barn by Victor, a 40-year-old farmer who sheltered and fed them. He also had sexual relations, first with the cousin, then also with Molly, who was then 13 years old. Molly's diary details these encounters, but the later memoir omits them entirely. The diary gives a sense of the insecurity of the two Jewish cousins, afraid that Victor, who often forgets to bring them food for days, will send them away. In Molly's diaries, these sexual encounters are both a girl's reach for something pleasurable in a world of death and a way to keep Victor hooked into his two young fugitives. In the memoir, Victor emerges unambivalently as a savior or a saint, but the memoir also recollects a series of unhappy post-war relationships with men, including her husband, that she retrospectively understands as abusive and a byproduct of feeling worthless. In a videotaped interview soon after the publication of Buried Words, Molly continues to praise Victor unreservedly. Responding to a question by her interviewer, she characterized their sexual relationship as, quote, entertainment. Her interviewer is clearly uncomfortable with her response. He stammers for an extended moment, trying to collect himself and proceed with the interview. Most viewers of the interview are similarly discomfited. We cannot help but see the transactionality in Molly's sexual relations with Victor, the elements of coercion, abuse, and power imbalance. But Molly pushes back against this reading of her life. She refutes the idea that Victor abused or victimized her. She wants to own the experience, to own the desire, the agency, the pleasure, the choice. She resists the perspective that would define this as abuse, define her as victim. In the interview, Applebaum acknowledges that at an earlier time, she would never have allowed the diary to go public, to be published. Now, however, she says, quote, my brain grew up and I have my own ideas. In different ways, shame remains an undercurrent of each of these sets of memory narratives. There remains the memory of being made into a thing, disempowered, doing things to survive that one would not have done ordinarily. Each of these three sets of remembrances struggle in different ways against shame, generating narratives that insist on the rememberer's agency, her ability to choose whether pleasure, a pragmatic calculus, or a combination of both. As they recollect and recount the past, none of these women act only for themselves. Hamlin insists repeatedly, quote, 3 or none. That is, either she, her mother, and her sister will survive, or none of them will. Heller's relationship protects her brother and her mother. Molly and her cousin make it through the years of hiding together. As the narratives describe it, the co-beneficiaries acknowledge and appreciate the actions, even if ambivalently. We may recollect the distinction that Primo Levi draws between 3 ethical positions: selfishness, that is acting for oneself alone; selfishness extended to the person closest to you, which in distant times a friend of mine appropriately called us-ism; and solidarity, that rare ethical stance of acting on behalf of everyone, the only position that Levi sees as impervious to shame. But the wonderful, understudied novelist Ilona Carmel, who survived a series of labor camps, punctures Levi's ethical hierarchy. Her 1969 novel, An Estate of Memory, was among the first books to focus exclusively on women in the camps. It figured strongly in the emerging discourse in the 1970s and 1980s about women's experiences and women's writing in the Shoah. Still considered one of the most significant literary treatments of Jewish women during the Holocaust, it traces the struggle of 4 women who bond together in a labor camp to protect the pregnancy of one of them and to smuggle the baby to safety. The women in Carmel's novel watch themselves do and say things they would once have thought unimaginable. Forced to make hideous choices, the women gradually abandon a priori concepts about morality and instead develop a code of behavior appropriate to their circumstance, altruism. To act on behalf of the group's survival becomes an absolute good. But even this minimal ethos unravels under the unspeakable pressures of Nazi atrocity. The central character asks herself, quote, what is it? Anything done for someone else is a sacrifice, a noble deed, but try to do the same thing for yourself, and the sacrifice becomes a disgrace. Why? I too am someone. I want to suggest that Levi's articulation of shame, agency too has a belated component, something that emerges in recollection and retelling. We know from memory studies and autobiographical theory that even at its most factual, memory is protean. It collapses or telescopes at moments of heightened affect. The present moment determines which moments of the past push themselves forward and how we interpret our own story. The way we tell a story changes over time as we change. Not that it falsifies itself, the facts remain, but the import of what is remembered and recounted, the meaningfulness, can shift or sharpen over time. In these memory narratives, shame and agency collide, morph, and intertwine as memory pushes its way into narrative. Thank you.
Very much. We have reached not the end of our session, but close to the end. We have 10 minutes left for questions and answers, and I'm sure there will be some. So you have the floor, please.
About the witness of your mother, we have I have a consideration about the representation of sexuality. I want to remember the participation of your mother to another important Holocaust documentary of 2007, Stalags. Stalags, that was about the bande dessinée en français, the cartoons published in Israel of sexual context in concentration camps that were a great scandal in Israel between the 15th and the 60s. and your mother was in this documentary, I remember.
It is pornography.
It was pornography, yes, it was pornography, a great scandal. I found a connection between your mother and Sardinia, because your mother was one of the first women to receive a Sokolov Prize. Sokolov was the aunt of one of the 3 Sardinian Jewish women about I will talk this afternoon. So we have a connection.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Only for this. Thank you.
May I speak? It's Bev Chance. Can you hear? Okay. Sarah, I was absolutely intrigued, but especially one of the things your title is, Since When Can't a Virgin Be a Whore? I'm curious about the title that you chose and wondered if it was connected to the amazing play, The God of Vengeance, written by Sholem Asch in about 1906, I think it was, where he actually talks about his daughter, who is a pure unmarried young woman, but he is running a brothel in his basement. And she joins the women in the basement and has a lesbian relationship. And the question emerges with that exact sentence: can a virgin still be a whore? And it's a fascinating thought, and I was just wondering if you had connected it to that, or where you got the idea for since when can't a virgin be a whore? This is fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know that work, but now you have intrigued me, and I will look at it. It's really a direct quote from a story by Ida Fink, in which a very young, inexperienced girl has to, or decides to, trade her virginity, as it were, to engage in transactional sex to get papers that she hopes will save her and save her mother. And it's a derogatory comment made about her by the man who insists on that bargain.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, please. I was going to ask, in the research that you did on queer relationships, have you been able to find any cases through the Shoah Foundation archive, and have you asked them to look at some of these relationships to see which interview you should look at?
So there are some scholars and historians at the minute that are looking at archival material. So Anna Haikova, Jennifer Evans, Xavier Nunn, for example. My work for this book particularly, it focuses on published testimonies, and that's largely in order that I can sort of look at how in narrative and for a sort of public audience these texts are being constructed and these particular experiences are being described. So I haven't used those archives for that reason. Okay.
Yes, we have one more question.
Thank you. It's actually for Dr. Ramsden as well. And I just wanted to ask your thoughts about Wanda Potolska's life afterwards. You know, she becomes this fierce moral advocate. She really shapes much of Catholic morality of the last 50 years with her friendship with Pope John Paul II and all of that. Mm-hmm. So I would just love to get your thoughts on how much of that do you think was because of her Polish Catholic upbringing, and how much of that was really driven by her experiences in the camp and her kind of revulsion to what she saw, as you talked about in your paper today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I didn't, because of the time limitation, I didn't give much space to Potolska's life afterwards. I think, of course, I think her medical work and her Catholicism can't be divorced from the attitudes that she displayed here, if that's sort of what you're asking. But it's important to consider the unique circumstances of each woman and her story. But these types of attitudes and these types of descriptions aren't just limited to Catholic women, Nazi opponents. They do appear in to varying degrees in the testimonies of Jewish women from various geographical areas. Sorry, I don't know if that really answered your question.
Yeah, I guess I was just really asking about her specifically and just how much of her experiences really drove her to become that advocate, I guess, is closer to it. So less about her Catholicism, more about her homophobia and her revulsions that you talked about today. How much did that drive her to really become this outward advocate and really shape, 75 years worth of teachings?
I mean, I think it's kind of impossible for me to sort of give an opinion on that. I don't know the degree to which she held these beliefs before she was in prison. So it's, I wouldn't really feel okay to sort of give an opinion. Sorry.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, yes, Kasia.
Thank you. Thank you for all presentation. I have a question to Stanislava. I would like to ask you about Frida Filipović's identity, how she identified herself. I mean, being a Jew was important for her, or when she started to think that this component of her life was important for her. For example, did she include this topic to the first volume of her short stories, Priče o ženama? Did she describe any of Jewish women in that volume, or she started to include this topic later to her texts?
She started to include that topic later, after the Holocaust. She belonged to the generation that the Jewish identity wasn't so important for them. Of course, they were aware of them, and it was a part of it, and in some way important. But most of them were unreligious, and in that way, it was not something that was in the same way important as for their parents. And this subject of not being religious and don't identify with the religion is important in the movie and in the novel from 2000, which she published, as we saw much later, based on the movie and based on one long short story from 1973, where she explained the first part of her life being in Belgrade just before the war. And I'm so thankful to Krinka, Vidaković, Petrov. I finally found who is one of the characters from Frida Filipović novel Gorke trave, The Bitter Grass. Hana is one of them, and it explains a lot of things. In the novel, she's also an anarchist, communist, and I knew it was autobiographical part of the novel, but didn't know exactly. And they studied together because Frida studied French as well as Hana did. So that was also in question in a novel and in the movie, and that's why I said that this character of the victim is so unconventionally and against all the stereotypes. And Frida Filipović always goes against stereotypes, and that was the part of her feminist engagement, which got the right shape in the Holocaust stories which she wrote and screenplayed.
Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of our panel, right on time. And now we're ready for our coffee break. And I want to thank once again all the presenters at this panel for really giving us this very good insights in all the topics, very interesting topics that you have covered. Thank you very much. Thank you as well.